Former Governor General David Johnston there responding to opposition calls for an inquiry into election meddling, but by all accounts, they won't get one. The former Governor General has officially made his recommendation not to call an inquiry, and the Prime Minister has accepted it. Let's break down the political fallout now with our front bench. Joining me this evening, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair. And the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. I feel like, Tom, if we had put money on our bets over the last number of weeks, collectively we'd have gone broke, because everyone was predicting that it seemed almost inevitable that there would not only A, be a recommendation for an inquiry, but B, the Prime Minister would take heed of that. The opposite has happened. There will not be a public inquiry. Where do the political vulnerabilities lie from where you sit?
Well, I'm going to address the first bit of your remarks first. It's not true that there's no public inquiry unless Justin Trudeau decides there's no public inquiry, because, of course, David Johnston has zero decision-making power. Mr. Trudeau asked him for his opinion. He gave it. But the Canadian public wants a public inquiry. It doesn't mean that we can't protect our secrets. They're two separate issues. We can have a full, formal public inquiry and, of course, go in camera when you're dealing with things. The Americans did that preparing the Mueller report. They do that in Congress all the time. CIA stuff, have it redacted, you bring it in. We're capable of doing the same thing, Vassy. I've been doing media across the country since this report came out. I watched the whole press conference, of course, with my old friend David Johnston. And I have to tell you that in every media that I've done this afternoon, right up until now, across the country, in English and in French, nobody's buying the report, because the essential part of what David Johnston is saying is, look, I've looked at this. You don't have to see it. You don't have to know anything more. I've looked at this, and who have I talked to? Well, I've talked to the people who are in Justin Trudeau's government, and they've told me that there's nothing to see here. They've shown me a bunch of documents that they've chosen for me. There's no contradictory evidence. There's no cross-examination. There's no ability to test witnesses. There's no ability to subpoena documents or people and make them appear with those documents and find out whether all this is true. So we're supposed to just take this on faith. And we're told, for example, that Mr. Justice Iacono, who's fine jurist, has given him an opinion, given David Johnston an opinion about no conflict of interest. But I'd love to know when that was done, because, of course, all this more recent stuff about the resignations at the Trudeau Foundation was against a backdrop of a very large payment by the Chinese Communist Party using front people here in Canada to give money to the Trudeau Foundation. I think that once Mr. Johnston knew that that was going to be under the microscope, he should have pulled back, but he went forward, made these recommendations today. But what about all the rest of it? What about the so-called Chinese police stations here in Canada? What about threats to someone like Michael Chong? Well, Mr. Trudeau tried to soften that today, saying, well, we didn't really know about threats. We knew that the Chinese were looking for information. So Mr. Trudeau's able to get that information. He comes and makes the affirmation, but we're never going to be able to look behind that screen and question that evidence. I think that that's where this thing is falling down. I think that Mr. Trudeau thought he was having a great day. He was going to get to move past this thing. Quite the contrary, Vassy. I'm convinced that this is going to dog them more than ever.
Well, it's interesting, Lisa, because that does seem to be the opening for the opposition, right? The report is kind of systematic in the, I think it's 9 allegations as they've been reported on through the media, and why, there are a couple of paragraphs about how he comes to the conclusion that that they largely lack context and are unfounded. But there's really no detail attached to that, in part, of course, because it's intelligence, it's secret intelligence. But it does, I think, Tom has a point there, leave an opening for the opposition to say, well, how did you make this determination, and why are we to believe you?
I mean, not just the opposition. We should all be shaking our heads on this notion that we get to appoint a single person to take a look at all the evidence, and then that single person's going to pat us on the head and tell us go away because I've looked at it and I'm here to tell you everything is okay. Is that how we're going to run our democracy going into the future? I invite you to think about a scenario that may not be too far off into the future in the United States, where you end up with a government that does something that you really disagree with. And it has implication, and it has foreign interference. And that person in charge appoints a friend who then comes back and says, we don't need an inquiry. Boy, I can imagine the outrage. I can imagine what we'd be talking about today as a result. That is no different from what we're experiencing here today. And I want to say one thing about this friend thing. When I was Minister of Labor, and Tom, you will remember this because I'm pretty sure you're the one that gave me all the hard time. I appointed an arbitrator for the Cup W Canada Post, arbitration that was going to be happening, the mediation. And at one point in time, the arbitrator who I chose was a Facebook friend of mine. Never knew who the person was, but he signed himself up as a Facebook friend. That was immediately struck down by the courts as being too close to me in terms of picking the arbitrator. Now, you tell me how David Johnston is the guy who's going to give us the assurance that everything is okay. That can't be the standard of law.
Well, that was kind of one of the other things that stood out, Brian, in the press conference was the sort of length of the answer that Mr. Johnston provided to defend his position there against the Conservatives' primarily criticism, which is that the optics of his appointment are not good. And we heard Michael Barrett kind of talk about that at length. Do you think that is a vulnerability going forward for the government? And the only quick caveat I'd add is it is Mr. Johnston's word, but he has invited NSICOP, the committee, to review his findings, and if they disagree with him, to be very public about that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a very important point to make. Let me start off by just saying that I think that an inquiry would have been in the political interest of the Trudeau government. And for many of the other reasons already mentioned, I think an inquiry would have been very helpful, and I think it would have been nice to have. But I also think, just on the pure politics, it would be a way in which the Trudeau government, I think, would be able to put this to bed finally. I also think that the findings would be probably somewhat the same tone, obviously probably more detailed, because this report is only about whether there should be an inquiry or not. Obviously, so he spoke about a few of the questions that are looming within this, within the purview of this discussion, but nevertheless, it was more about whether there should be inquiry or not. So there'd be more detail, of course, but I still think it'd be the same tone. So I think politically, Trudeau and company probably should have said, we want one. And to Mulcair's point, to Tom's point, yeah, they could probably still call it. But obviously, I also agree with Tom. They probably woke up today thinking today was going to be an okay day, and it's not going as well as they would have liked. Now, I like Lisa's little exercise about, alternate universe and sort of thinking things through. If there was any other rapporteur that was named, any other Canadian, it was Lisa Raitt, it was Mr. Benzie, Tom was called. If it was anybody else, and they would have said, you know what, to be fair, we looked at it. It could be a panel. It could be all of us. We were all asked to do it. And we looked at the stuff, and really, there's really no need for an inquiry. Let's pretend in that alternate universe that happened. Would Poilievre have said, oh, okay, no inquiry needed? It doesn't matter who was going to be the rapporteur, if it was a committee, if it was whatever it was. It did not matter who was going to say it. If they said no inquiry, Poilievre was not going to agree. So what I really don't like about today is David Johnston is a good Canadian. He is a good person. I've gotten the chance to know him just a little bit. I'm certainly a fan of his. And it doesn't matter who it would have been today. The Poilievre train was going to ride right over that person and find a way to discredit the report. It would have been a lot better to use the argument that Vassy, you used in the interview with Mr. Johnston, saying, well, look, fair points, but what about the idea and the points that being made, paraphrasing you, of course, that democracy and the people's trust in it would require an inquiry. I think that's a very fair point, and that's probably just enough for it to happen. So why wouldn't Poilievre just focus on that instead of kind of putting Mr. Johnston through the ringer here? And the last point I'll make is I do think that we should maybe even broaden this. I would like to see maybe a bit of an inquiry on interference in general, because my suspicion is that's probably not just China. And I think this is probably a challenge that we're going to be facing and democracies are going to be facing for a long time, and getting a good sense of what's happening in Canada and what we can do to fix it, and putting it all out in the open as best as you can with the as Tom said, with the redactions when needed, I think would be good for democracy.
Just quickly, Rob, I'll give you the last word. I asked Mr. Menegino earlier in the program, reading the Chinese statement, which asserted following this report that it's opposed to any interference in a country's internal affairs, whether the minister thought that to be true. In multiple times of trying to follow up, he wouldn't even specifically address China in a specific sense. He would only address what you referred to there, Brian, more broadly. Rob, last word to you. Who wins politically? Who loses today?
I'm not sure. It's one of those weird days, Vassy, where I'm not sure anybody won. You would think on on the basis of what happened, that Pierre Poilievre should have had a good day today. But I was watching his press conference in Quebec, and I thought he looked petulant and a bit sullen, and I was surprised that he kept going back to this the ski buddy and cottage neighbor line, which Michael Barrett used with you, so it's clearly they've tattooed it on their arms, which it's a cute line the first time, but by the time I heard Mr. Poilievre say it about 6 or 7 times in both official languages, it sounded like he'd been practicing it in front of the mirror while he was shaving this morning. So I don't think it has the resonance. This is a serious situation. It demanded a serious response, and we all agree, I think, that there should have been an inquiry should have been called. We all agree, I think. Even Brian will concede that the Prime Minister's office has done a terrible job of bungling this from the get-go. I mean, this whole thing has been a communications disaster, crisis management disaster like the Titanic. But having said all of that, I think there's a lot of soul-searching that we in the media have to do. I don't think this was a good day for Global TV, for example. Some of that stuff that was said in Johnston's report is not helpful to them, less critical of the Globe and Mail. And my colleagues at the Globe have done some fantastic work on this case. And I think they deserve credit, and we do deserve to see more transparency. So that's why I think a public inquiry would have been good. Tom's bang on. You can have an inquiry where secret information is not made public. And it would make this seem less like everyone's so glib, and I don't know. I was not impressed by any of them today. Maybe a day where everybody looked bad.
Well, that's why we have this panel, because nobody on it is glib, and you provide great analysis. Thank you, everyone, for the discussion this evening. I appreciate it. Lisa Ray